Hey everybody, it's Neil, and I'm just so thrilled to welcome you back to another chapter of our 333 chapter countdown of the 1,000 most formative books in the world. I've been experimenting with the super quick intro or the absent intro, and I've been thinking I miss you. So if you kind of love the super quick intro, just fast forward 5 minutes, you can jump in. But I want to give you a little bit of context and background to today's guests and to why I have them on the show. So, all right, April 1st, 2022, I had just released chapter 100 with Leslie from my basement, and I put on Twitter this tweet. I just got an email saying in the first 100 chapters of my podcast, I've had 56 male-identifying guests, 44 female-identifying guests, and 0 non-binary. The letter asked me to have more non-binary guests. Would love your guest suggestions on this or other areas you see underrepresented. And minutes later, I got a response from Dawn Alson, who writes, Neil, my first choice would be Alok Vaid-Menon, Vaid-Menon. I had never heard of Alok, so I looked into them. Right? And by the way, I love the community of 3 books. We always hang out at the end. We got the after party club. We've got the end of the podcast club. So who's Dawn? Dawn identifies on social media, on Twitter, as atheist, bibliophile, disabled, Trekkie, animal and nature lover, with a green heart, she/her/they/them, survivor, tattoo lover, and their location is Wolastoqiyik. That's Wolastoqiyik, which I had to look up. Of course, you know me, I had to. Wolastoqiyik means people of the beautiful river. It's identifying as an indigenous group that has long resided along the St. John River in New Brunswick and Maine. Okay, what we now call New Brunswick and Maine. Wolastoqiyik people live. There are 7,635 people according to the last census. Thank you, Dawn Alson, for the suggestion, because of course, what I did is research Alok. Who is Alok? A-L-O-K, Alok. Tell me a joke, Alok. That's what they say. I looked them up. They have a really popular book. They have several really popular books, but I ordered the most popular one with over 1,000 5-star reviews on Amazon. The book is called Beyond the Gender Binary. And when it arrives at my house, don't worry, I did not order from Amazon. No offense to Amazon if you order from them, but I did not order from them. It's a 63-page, tiny little pocketbook from the Pocket Change Collective, which is this really cool kind of activist-oriented small publisher, which is an imprint of Penguin Random House, okay? So it's inside the big gargantuan publisher, but this tiny little, they're looking for change in the world. I read Beyond the Gender Binary, honestly, in 2 days. It is gripping. I have so many dog-eared pages. You can hear me flipping through them right now. So many underlines. This book single-handedly shifted and grew my thinking when it comes to non-binary gender identification, and just the idea of the gender construct, the gender, the idea that there's 2 genders. That's how I grew up. There's man and woman. There's male and female. There's boy and girl. You have gender reveal parties. Is the cake going to be blue? Is the cake going to be pink? Are the clothes you wear going to be for a boy? Going to be for a girl? This is a story we have created on top of our culture, and I needed someone like Alok to kind of pop this bubble and explain the story from the outside, much as Yuval Noah Harari explains stories like money and culture and things like that in the book Sapiens. I will say very passionately that Beyond the Gender Binary by Alok Vaid-Menon completely will shatter the kind of bubbles or ideas that you may hold dear around gender, or you may hold dear or not. So I reached out to Alok. I told them that our guests are asking for them by name, and I just read their book, and I really loved the book, and here's some of my favorite things. And lucky for me, Alok agreed to hang out with me on a park bench, and you, in Central Park in New York City. Okay, so I fly down to Central Park in New York City. We sit on a park bench. We're kind of on the end of 2 park benches. You're hanging out in the middle of us. There's going to be birds around us. There's going to be people skateboarding by. We're going to hang out. We're going to talk about gender, beauty standards, librarian pizza parties, trans femininity, degendering fashion, denim platform shoes, queer history, colonization, banh mi sandwiches, self-love, and many, many other things. Before we jump in, I should give you a little bit of a bio because it's really impressive. Alok goes by they, them pronouns. Tell me a joke, Alok is something that they have said to remind you how to say their name. They were born in College Station, Texas, to parents from India and Malaysia. They are well, although there's no categories or words to describe them, they are an author, an artist, a comic, a poet, a speaker, and a media personality whose work explores gender, trauma, and belonging. They call for freedom from constraining gender norms, advocate for bodily diversity, gender neutrality, and self-determination. And they are the best-selling author of Femme in Public, which came out in 2017, Beyond the Gender Binary, which is the book I read and loved, came out in 2020, and more recently a poetry chapbook called Your Wound / My Garden. That came out in 2021. They created the hashtag degender fashion movement, which is a movement to degender fashion and beauty industries globally. Over the past decade, they have performed in over 50 countries around the world. And in fact, when I caught them in New York, they were just in between two cities on a tour that goes for 3 months into over like 20 or 30 countries. Like, it's crazy. You can go to their website and check it out at alokvaid-menon.com. Most recently, they have headlined the 2021 New York Comedy Festival, HBO's The Trans List, and Netflix Getting Curious with JVN. So, if you want to follow them on Instagram, that's probably the best platform because they've got millions of followers on there. It is at Alok V-Menon. Again, that's at ALOKVMENON. And if you want to follow them on the website, it's alokvmenon.com. ALOKVMENON.com. And now, without further ado, on this new moon, without any ads, sponsors, commercials, or interruptions, let's all fly down to New York City, hang out on a park bench with the wonderful, wise, and beautiful Alok. Let's flip the page into chapter 106 now. Okay, I just pressed record. Hi, Alok.
Hi.
Thank you for coming.
Of course, thank you for coming all the way.
Oh, my pleasure. It's a thrill to be in Central Park. I mean, I guess I sometimes try to ask guests, pick a location that they feel comfortable in, and does Central Park come to mind?
Yeah, I spent a lot of time here, actually. I've been trying to do this new thing of, self-care. You might have heard of it. It's been missing in action in my life for a while. And so the good thing about a park is that even if you're doing something really busy in your day, you can take 5 minutes and just go and walk the park.
Yes.
And even though I'm committed to ending all hierarchy, I'm a New York supremacist, unapologetically. And some people are like, how do you live in New York? There's no nature. I'm like, what are you talking about? Look, we're in nature.
Yeah, exactly. Not only are we in nature, we've got pigeons cooing at our feet.
Right.
There is it looks like wilderness right behind us. We're on a green bench. We're on two different benches, on the edge of two different benches touching each other, kind of like the painted green wood benches, metal in between, plants kind of spiking out through the bottom of them. Lots of people walking by us. There's people with masks and mesh hats. There's people in spandex shorts talking on phones. There's somebody skateboarding in camo pants. And so people are whizzing by us. We'll probably hear them in the background. We've got the birds here. It's a nice sunny day. And it's just a privilege to talk to you. Can you describe yourself in a word, a sentence, a paragraph to try to introduce?
You want all of them?
Yeah, all three.
Okay.
I've heard you and seen you answer interview questions, so I got to bring some tough ones. I got 10 pages of interview questions here for you.
Okay, here we go. One word, curious. One sentence, aspiring toward infinite unknowability. One paragraph. Alok is trying to reconnect with an ancestral song that was deliberately silenced because when heard, it would remind everyone that all binaries and categories collapse in the face of the primordial noise of being alive. Trying is their favorite word because it's the most honest approach to living a life oriented toward compassion. Compassion is a word that Alok tries to keep as a compass, not just near their heart, but near their fist, near their tongue, and near their feet.
Wow. Did you say ancestral, was it noise? Because I just watched a video of your aunt Urvashi, online. Lesbian, feminist, non-binary, 1992 Republican convention, speaking truth to power, calling out George W. Bush. So you grew up in College Station, Closet Station, Texas, parents from Malaysia and India, via Canada, meeting at McGill. I think you just told me as we walked here. I went to Queens, so some slight overlap. My mom's from Nairobi, Kenya. My dad's from Amritsar, India. So they came over and stayed in Canada. Your parents kind of kept moving to Texas. And you grew up in College Station, and you had a feminist mother, Indian, and a lesbian feminist aunt. So that's pretty rare in Indian culture, or maybe even at the time. What was it like growing up there?
Yeah, I feel like I spent so much of my 20s trying to differentiate myself from my family and being like, they're nothing like me. Like, I've outgrown them. And then now in my 30s, it's so obvious that I am like a direct imprint of so many of the foundational conversations and experiences I had around them. And it goes back even deeper. My grandparents on my mom's side were artists. They were painters and poets and novelists and playwrights. So I always grew up around art, and not just art, but art that challenged the status quo. My grandpa was contemporaries with Allen Ginsberg, and there's a story about Susan Sontag taking him to a gay wedding. So
where is this?
My grandpa immigrated from India to the U.S. in 1958.
Wow.
So he actually came on a boat. And he was here during the Beat Generation and this sort of like politicization of American literature in the 60s. And that deeply inspired him. So I would grow up with him teaching me about the history of political art and black protest. And unlike many Indian families, he would say to me, like, you're going to be told that black people are less than, and they're not. They're the reason that we're here. And they fought so that we could come and immigrate here. So I just grew up with a really beautiful...
What's that story? I'm sorry to say this. I don't know that story.
Yeah, so in the U.S. there's a law called the Immigration Act, U.S. Immigration Act 1965, which is how a lot of Indians legally arrived in the United States.
My dad's 66.
And it came through the efforts of civil rights organizing in the U.S.
Ah, right. Okay. Yeah. Martin Luther King and civil rights movement. So, but despite that, because I've also listened to a lot of interviews with you, and I've heard stories, Indian families would get together for the potluck dinners, as I read in your wonderful book, Beyond the Gender Binary, which I've got many pages dog-eared and flapped here. You would put on shows. But when you did that in first grade, in front of the school, you were laughed at. And despite that activist upbringing, you sounds like, I won't use the word closeted, but you, what's the word, degendered, or you...
dissociated, maybe.
Dissociated.
Yeah. Or
attached yourself, or you were put in a box of being called a boy.
Yeah. I feel like it's a both and, like everything is. My parents had the best intentions, and I was growing up in a time where there was just no widespread vocabulary about people like me, or even how to parent people like me. And so, like many parents, my parents did what they thought was the most benevolent and kind thing, which was not talk about it, because to talk about it would mean to make it real. And looking back, I always asked them, I'm like, it was so obvious. Like, I didn't just leave breadcrumbs, I left entire banh mi sandwiches that, like, something's different, you need to bring it up. And they were just, and they're like, well, we didn't really have...
What do you mean banh mi sandwiches?
When I was 7 years old and my mom was tucking me into bed, I said, I'm queer. And I had learned the word from my dad's British children's literature that he read growing up in Malaysia, in colonial Malaysia. So I was reading in Blyton, I was reading all these people using this word queer, which just meant strange or odd or different. Yeah. I didn't understand it had any valence around gender, sexuality, but I knew that I was different. I knew that people looked at me differently, and I was trying to clue my parents in to, like, be curious with me, help me figure out who I am. And now my mom at least is honest. She said, we didn't really grow up in an emotionally vulnerable household, did we? And I think this is where I'm trying to, like, heal from my family dynamics, is we were extremely intellectual, extremely analytical about the world, but the emotional impact of that world on us, we never spoke about. And so I think in some ways, a lot of people are like, how could you had such a nurturing environment, It was nurturing in that I was given the vocabulary to describe everything in the world, but not to describe how I felt about everything in the world.
Yeah. I mean, thinking about my own upbringing, mental health never discussed, gender certainly never discussed. Like so many of these pieces you're starting to really unlock for us, and I'm as somebody who's watching your work and reading your work, it's just a beautiful gift to the world, a service to kind of push us forward here. You mentioned gender. It's a big part of your identity. I've picked out a few quotes on gender. I wonder if we could I could just offer them back to you, if you could expand, elucidate, however you want to open them up for us. The body is three-dimensional language. Beauty is the harshest editor. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. Beauty is kind of a bludgeon in the society that whacks us over and over and over again into discipline, into reinforcing social ideas of how we should be. And that way beauty has been used as an instrument or a vehicle of social control. I think a great illustration of this is body hair, right? It's so funny to me how people use words like natural and authentic when in fact a political aesthetic, which is hairlessness, which is not natural, postures itself as the natural form of femininity.
Yeah.
And when you ask people
and
why
masculinity
do you,
now too,
increasingly,
yeah.
And when you ask people why do you shave, it's like they haven't even thought that there's a way to not.
Yeah.
And that's because beauty has actually been about disappearance. And the way that I'm speaking about beauty is different. It often makes people uncomfortable because what I'm actually saying is that beauty is about looking like yourself, not having to emulate some other pre-existent standards. And so when we understand that our bodies are three-dimensional language, language is constantly shifting and changing and creating and combusting, and that's what beauty does. But then when normative beauty enters the chat, it actually silences us in the same way that any other form of censorship does.
Yeah, and it's interesting about the hair because I've heard you describe yourself as a bearded and in a dress. You've used that in the cover of your book, Beyond the Gender Binary. There's no beard actually in this clip art drawing of you, but you've got very long hair on top with a shave on the side of your head, chest hair, and I don't know if that's a sarong, but
no, it's a gown I made.
It's a gown you made. So yeah, the combining, and also I remember there's a restaurant in downtown Toronto called Fresh, and I remember 10 years ago, I went in and a woman, lifted her arm who was serving us, and she had armpit hair. And I remember feeling inside myself the reaction. Oh my gosh. And then later, my sister-in-law got a job there, and I said, what's the rule there about what you have to wear? She said, there's only one rule, no armpit hair allowed to be visible.
Wow.
That's the only rule they had on dress code.
Right.
And interesting, I thought that if you're going to pick one, that was it.
Right.
And I mentioned that because on the cover of your website, there's you with your arms out, beautiful hair everywhere, armpit hair, arm hair, shoulder hair, and wearing a dress. And you really kind of poke at that norm in society, and you help challenge it for us. Now, if I see that, it doesn't give me that same reaction. So is this to your point about unlearning or trying to get out of the water that we were kind of groomed in?
Yeah.
No pun intended.
I think it's a real illustration of what I was trying to say in my bio in a paragraph, which is being alive is inherently unruly. There's no norm. Yeah. There's no category. There's no word that can encapsulate being alive. And so actually so much of the work of healing is about being able to sit and situate oneself in what people see as chaos or incongruous or wrong or dissonant. And
George Saunders called it inchoate motion in chapter 75 of this show.
And just sit with it and be okay with it. And just witness it and be like, this is me. And the deep inability for ourselves and our society to do that, I think, is what actually leads to so many of the crises that we're facing. And so that's why body hair has been such an interesting landscape for me to talk about these ideas of beauty, humanity, race, gender, because it's so normalized that we should be removing it. In the same way it's normalized that we should be removing our own creative voice. In the same way it's normalized that we should be removing our own unique points of view. In the same ways in which it's been normalized that beauty is about self-immolation. I don't think it is. I'd rather set fire to other things than ourselves.
Yeah, I saw your post about corsets, the history of corsets and stuffing ourselves into ways to kind of provide figure. You have a great quote at the very end of Beyond the Gender Binary. It's like, men are curvy just like women, you know, and people are come in all shapes and sizes. Here's another quote. I experience gender as it's defined by other people as an obstacle to my spirituality, but gender as it's defined by me as an exercise in my spirituality.
Yeah, I think that's the same sort of work I'm doing there around the term beauty. And sometimes I find it helpful to say normative beauty or normative gender, because normative gender is the gender binary, which tells us that we should gender arbitrary objects, emotions, feelings, aesthetics, and that it's external. When I'm talking about gender, I'm actually talking about something that's divine and spiritual, that's not actually about an aesthetic. And I think that confuses a lot of people, because they'll be like, okay, if your gender is who you are, not what you look like, Alok, then why do you dress in the way that you do? And I want to remind people, if my gender is in fact my soul, then even my body is playing dress up. So we're all playing dress up. So the scrutiny of me is like somehow performing gender is a red herring, because we're all playing dress up if fundamentally we are something that's non-visible. So the way that gender is defined for me is gender is an intention to be able to walk on the earth and feel the ground beneath my own toes, to be able to laugh and feel the wind chime of my own laugh. It's actually an ability to practice presence. And so when I am getting situated in a day, gender is how I situate myself to be able to speak like this. People ask me, how do you speak like this? How do the words come to you? How do you write? It's because I'm lucid. And I know I'm lucid because I've been dissociated before. So gender, in a spiritual sense, which was so related to decolonizing my ideas of beauty, of progress, of success, of being, is actually a pathway for me to be able to channel a higher truth.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Beautiful. I have so many quotes. But in this dissociative state that you talk about, I know you lived in that place a lot in your childhood, because you talk about that in your book. And I know that after the incident, on stage in front of the whole school laughed at me, is kind of what you wrote. You were bullied heavily and called names and so on. And at some point, I believe in that childhood, you read the book. I'm just going to flip to the page so I can introduce it for everybody. Eye of the World by Robert Jordan, published in 1990 by Tor Books, T-O-R Books, Tom Doherty and Associates. The cover's like, there's different covers, but the cover I've got here is two riders on horseback riding through a forest against a deep blue sky with a huge glowing full moon. There's flowing capes, there's braided hair, there's long swords. Robert Jordan lived from 1948 to 2007, best known for his series The Wheel of Time, 14 books and a prequel. This is book 1 of the Wheel of Time series. What happens in the book when the Two Rivers is attacked by Trollocs, a savage tribe of half men, half beasts? 5 villagers flee that night into a world they barely imagined, with new dangers waiting in the shadows and in the light. File this wonder 813.54 Dewey Decimal Heads for American 20th Century Fiction. Alok, tell us about your relationship with The Eye of the World by Robert Jordan.
I'm so geeked out to be talking about this, because I don't think I've ever spoken publicly about my deep love of The Wheel of Time. When people see me walking around New York City in headphones, I often think they must think that I'm listening to some like cool music. I am actually listening to the audiobooks of Wheel of Time. I spend hours every day. Anytime I'm doing laundry, I'm listening to Wheel of Time. It's my favorite ambient background noise to anything that I'm doing. So the story goes like this. I was in 5th grade, and there was a program in my school to encourage people to read called the AR reading program, where you could read a book and then take a little quiz and get points, and then you could get prizes based off of your points. The ultimate prize, if you got 400 points, was to skip a day of school, get picked up by a limo, and spend the day eating pizza at the librarian's house, which was like goals. So me and my nerdy friend group were like, we are going to be in the 400-point club. You get a shirt too.
How many points per book you read?
It depends on the length of the book.
Oh, okay.
So because the Wheel of Time series is very long.
14 books.
And they're like thick books.
Like 500, 600, 700 pages each.
I was like, I was looking up what are the books that are the most points, and I saw the Wheel of Time. So I was like, okay, friends, we're going to take this on together. So me and my like peak nerd. We're talking like peak quintessential.
I don't know if you hit that yet, Alok.
I was very, very nerdy in my past, and in my present. People don't see that part of me. And we started reading Wheel of Time, and it just changed and rocked our entire lives. We would start speaking in Wheel of Time, speak to each other. So like when we parted ways with each other, we'd say things like, peace, favor, your sword. I started to say that I practiced the way of the leaf, which is a philosophy of a tinker people in Wheel of Time, which is obviously, I think, modeled off of Roma people, where they practice a kind of pacifism, where if anyone was to attack them, they would rather be attacked than rise up against them because they fall like a leaf from the tree without resistance. And that was the first time I learned about pacifism.
Wow.
And so then I became a pacifist, and I wanted to become a conscientious objector to war, and I started trying to apply so that I couldn't be drafted into the U.S. military.
At age 10.
Yes, I started thinking about peace in really deep ways. And so this book actually gave me vocabulary to describe so many of the things that I needed to know. So basically, in the Wheel of Time, the concept is that we're all a thread that's being weaved into a wheel, that life actually is a circular, cyclical system. So rather than time...
Which I think we could agree it is.
Yes. Rather than time being linear, time is a circle. And the world of the Wheel of Time is set in is actually set in the future, but it feels like the past because this world has been destroyed and people are having to reinvent technology, light, equipment. And that basically it's a struggle between the shadow and the light, and that the pattern puts out one person named the Dragon Reborn who's able to realign the entire patterns of the world. And that idea for me, that we were all threads and therefore weaved into each other, and that every impact of every behavior could impact someone else, that was so powerful for me because it allowed me to denaturalize reality and to understand that what I was seeing and what I was going through was one iteration of what could be, not a permanent structure of what would always be. And it also taught me that there was a kind of magic capable of not just changing myself, but changing the world around me. It gave me permission to be curious and to wonder. I think a lot of my work as an adult now is not flattening myself as being closeted when I was younger, but actually coming up with new ways to describe it, like I was daydreaming myself into existence, or I was in an artist residency in my mind. I was actually trying to imagine the world that I'm living now, such that the minute that I was able to disclose to the world what I was so confident, and people were like, how? And I'm like, I've been practicing in my head. And Wheel of Time was part of my practice. And it's funny because now that I'm out more about being a Wheel of Time fan, there's a lot of trans people of color who are telling me, I used to read Wheel of Time too.
Really?
I used to be at the launch of every new book at the local bookstore, and it would be me and like cis white dudes, like so excited to read this book all night.
I'm picturing like Pac-Man t-shirts.
Yes. And now I know that there's actually so many of us, and I ask, it's like a very gendered book. There's a lot of racist tropes, like I don't want to romanticize it in that way. And I ask my peers, like, what was it about this book that really stood with you? And what all of us basically just say is this idea of magic. Like in the Wheel of Time, there are people who can channel, and they channel spirit, air, water, earth. And they can weave those in order to make magic happen in the world. And only certain people are born with the capacity to channel. And just this idea that we could have magical powers, I think a lot of people like Harry Potter for this reason, but I just want to tell all the Harry Potter fans, like, you've got nothing on Wheel of Time. The capacity for Robert Jordan to storytell, because what he's doing is so meta that actually each character is a thread in the entire structure of the 14 books. So like there are clues in book 1 that actually connect to book 14.
No way.
And the amount of storytelling is that each chapter is often from a different perspective of a different character. So you see the same scene told by different people. I mean, it's just incredible story writing. I wish that I had gotten to meet him when he was alive, because I just truly think that if I was able to write a science fiction or fantasy series, that would be the greatest creative accomplishment of my life.
Yeah. And you talk about growing up, without words, without language, without nomenclature. This book didn't give you direct words, language, nomenclature, but it helped articulate through fantasy. That's the genre that it was placed in. Not that a lot of people disagree with genre in general in books. That's another thing we can talk about. There's the kind of the binary of genre when it comes to books. But now today, are part of a world where we're getting a lot of new language. Where's the language going today? And as you talk about the divine, you talk about channeling love, you talk about these things in terms of gender, where's the migration? How will you look back in 20 years from now as you're looking back 20 years into your past and say, oh my gosh, we didn't even have a word for this yet?
It's funny because the more that we develop more language, the more ambivalent I'm becoming about language as a process. Because I actually think that so often we're speaking the same thing and we get so upset that we're just not using the same words to do it. Like, I think
words create rifts
Yes.
as opposed to connection.
Exactly. I think that actually a lot of people have a desire for belonging or a desire for freedom. And those things, those desires, those emotions, those impressions, those are things that I feel like are more true than language. In order for language to exist, there has to be a cut. Like, I could say, hi, my name's Alok, I'm non-binary. But the truth is, that's not a word that I came up with. That's a word that other people told me that I was because of whatever. And my most honest form, I'm not even Alok. That's a name that was given to me by someone else.
Right.
I'm actually noise. And that's why I'm really interested in the idea of noise.
Even when you introduce yourself as transfeminine,
Yeah.
as I'm researching, I'm like Googling transfeminine presenting because I'm like, there's not a clear definition of what that means amongst different people. So now I'm struggling and nervous to speak to you because I'm like, I don't want to get this wrong.
I think language means we're already going to get it wrong. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
Is that language is already an imperfect practice. And that doesn't mean that we should try it. I think we should built into the DNA of language is that there's a capacity to get it less wrong. It's never about getting it right. It's about getting it approximating.
Hang on to that thought, though. Even the name Alok was given to me. So if we remove this, though, then what are we?
I think that's what the purpose of being alive is figuring out. And I don't know if I'm ever going to figure it out in the terms of like definitive answers. But I think when I'm saying curious, what I'm trying to do is investigate what I was meant to be. And I constantly outgrow that story of what it was. I think if you'd asked me 3 years ago what my purpose was or who I was, it'd be very different than now. So now that's why I think I've reoriented to being like, rather than even trying to ascribe a narrative to my life, I'm just trying to live it. Rather than trying to a word to my identity, I'm just trying to live it. Living is the creative expression. And to your point around transfeminine, these are all words that I had to levy in order to become coherent and intelligible in a world that believes in the gender binary.
Of course.
But in a world without the gender binary, asking me what my gender would be so, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Right now it's made to matter.
Yes.
And so transfeminine is a word that I use because when I walk down the street in a skirt versus when I walk down the street in just a pair of shorts, my social reality fundamentally shifts.
Right.
People see me as a threat, as dangerous, as wrong, as disgusting. So how am I supposed to...
You said you get spit on every day.
100%. And how else am I supposed to draw attention to that without a word? But that's only the precursor. What I want then is people to enter with a word, but then to have the more deep conversation to be like, why are we even caring about what other people look like to begin with anyways?
I know.
Why have we collapsed who we think people are based off of their flesh bags? How can we reorient a way of seeing each other beyond visibility?
I know, and part of the problem, okay, so when I applied to school the first time, it was like you drop down, male or female.
Right.
When I applied to school the second time, it was like drop down 7 options, okay? Why is there a drop down? You're at the forefront of the degender fashion movement, but you've also articulately pointed out, which I'm jumping on because I've listened to you a lot, like, why are we labeling this anywhere at all for any reason?
Yeah. That's my dream. My dream is that gender becomes obsolete as a category to divide people through because it no longer has a unified meaning. Because people can still use gender terms for themselves, but there's so many ways to be a woman or so many ways to be a man that when people would say it, it would be like, okay, what does that mean to you? It becomes a story and less of a category.
Yeah, and you've also had that great quote, which I can't find right now as I'm looking for the paper. Oh, here it is. Masculine doesn't have to mean not feminine. Feminine doesn't have to mean not masculine. Again, you constantly evoke the idea of these strictures and structures and stories that we tell ourselves as a way to illuminate for everybody that we don't need any of them.
Yeah. We need each other. We don't need categories. We need each other. We don't need, labels. And that's, I think, so much of the intention. In the same way that my parents intended to love me by not speaking up. So many things are actually through good intention. They come from genuine desires for love and connection. But we don't actually communicate that what we're seeking is love and connection. I noticed in myself, and the trajectory of my life as a writer and thinker, I first defaulted to rage, to saying, how dare you not see me? And then now I'm able to be like, what I was asking for was for love and connection. But it was too dangerous to ask for love and connection. And I think what I'm trying to really do with my poetry in particular is this difficult dance of using language to unravel itself, like using language to disintegrate, and to actually say, there are certain needs and desires that surpass my ability to articulate them.
Except that when you go on Netflix and you're trying to find a movie to watch, there's a list of genres or categories that you're using to help make that decision, i.e., the idea of categorization gives us purchase that we latch onto in order to accelerate decision making, in order to ease choice. You know, when you go to McDonald's, there's the dinner, there's the breakfast. You know, we're using all of these arguably as crutches to simplify our way of living, but we're doing so in exchange. I think what you're saying is in exchange for a more accurate interaction with reality.
Yeah, I would just say right now we're doing all these things. We haven't yet practiced and created a world yet where we can ambition beyond category, but I also think that there's anarchy in it right now. There's so many other things that we don't categorize, like grief. You know, when people are in grief, they are one day so healed and ready and integrated, and then the next they're like, oh my God,
yes,
this is destroying and pulverizing me.
Yes.
So when it comes to emotion, we've created a space like love.
Yes.
Where people are allowed to be inconsistent and idiosyncratic. What if we were to do that due diligence to everything? And I think it's possible to do that, but to do that, we actually have to practice vulnerability. I think so much of the need for category comes from a need of, if you don't understand me, then you won't accept me. But what if acceptance was not conditional at all? Like, what if we just already operated from the premise that everyone belongs? If we operated from that premise, I don't know if categories would be as important.
I know, and then you get to the place where you're like, isn't it crazy that we're so split, it's just politically, into two things? You know, when I was growing up in Canada, we had 7 political parties. Then it was 5. Now it's 3. Like, we are almost forcing the issue more because of the algorithmic interference we have that splits. I think at the root of every computer is a 0 or a 1.
Right.
You know, so at the root of every computer is it's a flicked switch one way or the other. So everything that the algorithms feed us this is through how look around the park, people are all looking at their phones, right? We're all looking through a lens that sorts us into these things. So I aspire to the place you're at and you're moving through and you're getting through and teaching us to get through. I just worry about the steps that help us get there. I mean, you know,
I think we get there by living it, and that living it means that it's going to be uncomfortable. Me living a non-binary life, not just in terms of my gender, but in terms of everything I try to bring that sense of anti-duality or anti-dichotomy to, gets me in a lot of trouble. And that's why people don't do it. It's because it's easier. It's easier to not. And I think my message to the world is, even though it's easier to lie, it's easier to fit into preconceived ideas of who we should be, fantasies that other people have written. It's not spiritually fulfilling.
Yeah.
And because so often people are choosing the easy route and not the spiritually fulfilling route, that's what leads to the crises that we have right now.
Yeah.
Is because people have practiced self-betrayal time and time and time again.
Yeah. And you've also talked about how, as you live this way, although you experience a tremendous amount of vitriol and anger and hate, etc., projected towards you, you talk about puke emojis being sent to you every day, people hitting you, groping you, asking you about your genitals, etc., in public. You also talk openly about how you live in a place of deep love, with deep connection, with deep people around you. And it almost sounds like you're living in a very enlightened place at the same time. You can look at the stuff getting thrown at your feet and just regard it, you know, as the Buddha would, kind of thing.
Yeah, I really feel like, actually, I'm able to immediately understand that all of this is projection, that word that you use, has nothing actually to do with me. It's me reminding people that they've clipped their own wings and that they have stubs there that are still bloody and bruised. And they haven't addressed that.
So when they see you, they think poorly of what's happened to them.
They're not even capable of thinking that. That's the thing about trauma, is that it dispossesses us of the even ability to pinpoint what it is. So right now, it's easier for so many swaths of people to demonize immigrants, Muslims, trans people, black people, indigenous people, than it is to reckon with their own pain. But it's all about the pain of their own clipped wings. And that's why we have to go internal in order to go external. And this is what I've been saying for a long time, and people before me have been saying for thousands of years, is that the work begins intimately.
Yeah.
It actually begins with the intimate practice of self-acceptance.
Yeah.
And most people have not done that work and will not do that work.
No, I mean, it's hard.
Yeah, but it's necessary.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So you're 10 years. You didn't tell us about the limo ride and the pizza. Was it as good as you'd imagine?
Epic. It was epic.
And you got to go with all your friends. They all hit 400 points?
Yeah, we were all out there getting picked up at like 6:30 a.m. in this limo.
6:30 a.m.
And we were just living our best lives. It was amazing.
At the librarian's house.
And I'm still actually friends with a lot of those kids. And The Wheel of Time actually has just now become a new TV show. And Eye of the World is a new series. And we waited to watch it together. And we had a party together back in College Station, Texas. Just like a pizza party. And we watched it all together. We watched all of the behind the scenes, all of the analysis. We were mad about the parts that weren't consistent with the book. But then debating about it. It was so beautiful. And I just feel so grateful for fan culture, because I have this thing in my back pocket now that will allow me to feel immediate proximity and familiarity with other people.
It's interesting, though, that you immediately want to watch it, because when I really love a book, I abstain from watching. I've never seen the Harry Potter movies.
Wow.
Purposely. I hate that Daniel Radcliffe is the picture in my brain. I like the picture that I made up.
I had those concerns, but I was so geeked out because this show casts more black and brown people in a fantasy genre than has ever been cast.
Oh, interesting.
And so it's the first time that I saw these magical worlds populated by people who look like us. And it was actually profoundly therapeutic for me. I called my manager and I was like, I need to appear on the show. I don't know if I want to have a recurring role. I don't know if I can commit to being in Eastern Europe where they're filming this for the next 10 years, but I really want to show up. This is so cool because I think it's going to give a lot of young black and brown kids permission to be magical.
Yeah.
And that's so important.
Ooh, permission to be magical. One of the interviews I listened to before chatting with you today was that you were you were on the precipice of going back to your 10-year high school reunion. But I haven't heard any interviews about how that went.
It was very fun. I, of course, had to coordinate my outfit to be camp. So I wore denim wedge platform shoes and a mini skirt.
To Texas?
Yes. And I pull up.
And a mini skirt?
Yes. And I pull up. And
nothing else?
And I don't even remember the top. It was unremarkable. But I pull up and I'm thinking it's going to be this come to Jesus, powerful reckoning moment. And it's just totally not.
Yeah.
And then I kind of liked how ordinary and anticlimactic that was. It was just kind of okay, cool. And the people who you wouldn't expect to be there were there, and the people you did weren't. But the best part about coming back is that trip I put together a pride party in my hometown at our local gay bar, the place that I started going when I was 18 years old. And
Skid Row, I think, right?
I brought back drag queens from Dallas, from Houston, from Austin, all across Texas. And we threw this huge party in College Station, Texas, and I performed. And it was so emotional for me because I think it was at 50 years of Stonewall. And what I was sort of saying on stage there is the future. Stonewall was the beginning of the gay liberation movement in the United States. It's why we have Pride. It was in 1969 at the Stonewall Bar in New York City. People see it as the beginning of the contemporary gay rights movement, but one of the books we're going to discuss interrupts that trajectory. But it's 50 years after Stonewall, and people are asking these questions what's the future of the LGBTQ movement? And I just saw it right there. It's in rural southern and Midwestern states where none of this East and West Coast progress has made it, where people don't feel safe to exist in public. And it felt so gratifying and humbling to be there in a small town in Texas, being this is what I'm most proud of. Y'all, it's so hard. It's so hard in Texas right now when our governor is literally persecuting supportive parents of trans kids. And I was just speaking about magic, I was just at a protest outside the governor's mansion in Austin, and a young trans boy came up to me with a wand that he painted in the trans color flags. And he said, hey, I get bullied so much at school, so I pretend I'm a wizard and can make them go away. I know you get bullied too. Here, I wanted you to have my wand, right? And I'm sitting here like, I grew up being bullied at school, but not by politicians. And now we have an entire generation of trans kids in the South who are being picked on by the very elected representatives that they see on TV, giving permission to people. This is going to destroy a generation. That kind of trauma as a kid is going to manifest for the rest of their lives. And so I just think it's really important to uplift and amplify and be there for queer and trans people in the South.
In some ways, it almost seems like the higher it goes in terms of what you're talking about is also the last bastion of fear's place, right?
Okay, don't allow me to take your gig from you, but I'm going to transition to our second book because it just is so related.
It's perfect. Can I introduce it for everybody?
Yeah, totally.
Okay, it is, and we are here. It is Gay New York, which I have right sitting beside me. Just want to get it in order. Gender, Urban Culture, and the Making of the Gay Male World from 1860 to 1940. The book is written by George Chauncey, 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 published in 1994 by Basic Books. I'm holding the book in front of me. It's about 500 pages. It's a paperback. It's got like an Art Deco-y kind of Arial narrow type of font. The top, Gay New York, has updated edition on top. The blurb reads extraordinary. One of the most fascinating works of American social history I've ever read, from Frank Rich. Cover photo is of two men in top hats, black suits, bow ties. One is lighting a cigarette with the match illuminating his face. The other is looking up at him. George Chauncey was born in 1954 and is an American professor of history at Columbia University and has been an expert witness in over 30 gay rights cases. This book is the award-winning, field-defining history of gay life in New York City in the early to mid-20th century. It brilliantly shatters the myth that before the 1960s, Stonewall, as you mentioned, gay life existed only in the closet, where gay men were isolated, invisible, and self-hating. Drawing on a rich trove of diaries, legal records, and other unpublished documents, George Chauncey constructs a fascinating portrait of a vibrant, cohesive gay world that is not supposed to have existed. File this one, Dewey Decimal Measure 305.3. It tells you where the problems are. Social sciences / people by gender or sex / specific groups of men. Alok, tell us about your relationship with Gay New York by George Chauncey.
This is my favorite academic text ever created, and I've read a lot. And I think it's actually one of the best works of history I've ever read. It's phenomenal. I first read it my freshman year in college. My sister recommended it to me. She was a senior in college at the time.
Wait. You're freshman Stanford.
Mm-hmm.
Your sister's a senior at Stanford.
No, she was a senior at another school, but she was writing her senior thesis on the history of the gay rights movement, and she had read this book. And I read it in Orvishi's apartment in the Upper West Side, just a few minutes away from here, in her window seat. And I just could not get up. I just kept reading it. I was in New York, and I was reading this book about New York. And I would just go to some of the areas in New York as I was reading it. And that's where I knew I'm going to move to New York, and I'm part of this tradition and this legacy. And the reason it relates to what we were talking about before is that a lot of people accuse non-binary people of being some newfangled phenomenon. And I just think that that speaks to the failure of our history education system in this country in many factors. You know, what you see now is the popular refrain that indigenous peoples have been outside of the gender binary for hundreds, if not thousands of years, of course. But even in white Anglo settler America, there were non-binary people. In fact, in the 1930s, in the United States, it was called the pansy craze, where fairies, pansies, who were gender variant people, who were often assigned male at birth, wearing what people would call traditionally feminine garb, would be hosting some of the most vivid and vibrant performances, theater nights, clubs.
Front page of the newspaper.
Yes, front page of the newspaper. And actually, Hollywood execs, beauty industry people, fashion industry people would come to our shows, copy our aesthetics, our ideas, and then make it mainstream. And it just irritates me because actually what happened was the world wars. And with war, there was the clenching down on gender norms because of people's sense of fear. And there's this deep need to defend the home front and to revive the American family. And so many of these places got completely erased, disappeared. We saw more policing, more criminalization, more legislation. So actually, when we learn gay history and queer history, we realize it's not this trajectory that goes from being oppressed to being free. It actually undulates based off of larger factors that often have to do with war and economy. And reading that is actually so important to understand this political moment we're in right now, because in the United States right now, there are 280 pieces of anti-LGBTQ legislation being circulated, the most ever recorded in U.S. history. And we're talking about extremely draconian laws that are trying to criminalize us for existing.
Yeah.
And people keep on asking, how is this happening? It's 2022. I'm like, you're not a student of history. Because if we actually learn history, they come for queer people first. Why? It's because queer people template possibility, autonomy, and choice, which are ethics that the status quo does not want.
It's a real threat to the system.
Yes, because then people begin to question what they thought was reality or absolute or permanent.
Yes.
And so it's really frustrating to me right now, because when I'm speaking about the crisis of anti-trans violence and anti-trans discrimination, I'm like, we're blowing a whistle about the fabric of our democracy. This is not just about trans people. This is about the fact that hundreds of laws that rely on fake news, and I'm being very intentional in my deployment of that term, misinformation, disinformation, are being passed and circulated as factual when they're not. Because social media companies are making money from circulating lies about us because they go viral.
Well, controversy, more eyeballs, more ads.
Right?
Yeah. And this book is a 100-year history, but you also talk about the 500-year history and the 1,000-year history. I've heard you talk about colonialism in India in the 1700s when the British came over. When they came over, they said, hey, everyone needs to put male or female on a piece of paper. But before that, I think I've heard you say it wasn't like that. Can you educate for me and those people listening just the history of non-binary gendering in? Can you go however far back you know? And I know you read a lot more.
We can go from the beginning of time. We can go, like, name an ancient civilization. We've got illustrations and examples of what we would now call trans and non-binary, but it's important to understand that would be anachronistic because these are recent terms. Like, so people will try to say things like Joan of Arc was trans, and I'm always like, I understand the impulse. We want to say that, like, we've always been here. But I think as a student of queer history, one of the first things we talk about in queer history is that terms are historically and culturally contingent.
Yeah.
And so when I say there were fairies, inverts, androgynes, pansies, we could call those non-binary, but also we have to be precise that that's not how people saw themselves.
Right.
They would say, I'm a pansy. And that might mean what we might say in non-binary now, but in that context.
And that word means different things.
Totally different things.
Over time.
So in the context of South Asia, there's actually a plethora of indigenous terms. Hijra, Koti, Aravani.
What do those three words mean? I've heard you say them before.
Yeah, they're basically terms within local languages to describe people who are what we in the West would call intersex, gender nonconforming, or non-binary.
Okay.
It's
and
more
when you say intersex, what do you mean?
People who display physical attributes that society would say are both male and female, or defy our ideas of division of society into biological males and biological females. Intersex people have been and continue to be a natural variation in the human population, but we're often taught that there are just males and just females when that's just not true. And so basically what happened is that when the British invaded South Asia, they institutionalized the Western legal system. And the Western legal system relied on hereditary law and the family unit.
Yes.
There was not that concept of the family unit in South Asia as a nuclear family, just as the immediate family. There's a much more porous understanding of family.
A village.
But in order to establish the nuclear family unit and hereditary transmission of property, you had to have a clear distinction between the gender binaries. So that women were caretaking in the home, domestic, and that men were the inheritors of property, which then went down through lineage. And so what a lot of scholars of this moment basically argue is that Hijras, gender non-conforming people who are outside of these British conventions of man or woman, didn't just challenge the gendered system, but challenged the entire legal architecture of the colonial project. So they had to be invisibilized because their way of living actually contradicted the boundaries that were being created by the colonial nation state. So, for example, Hijras would often perform and transgress state lines that were being drawn by the British.
Yes.
And the British would be like, no, you belong in this province. They'd be like, we've been traveling and doing this for a long time.
Yes.
And that's why traveling people, Romani people, Roma people across the world have always been penalized and criminalized because they reveal all these arbitrary distinctions we make between nation states are just made up, right?
Right.
And so basically Hidra's way of living challenged the epistemic authority of the colonial nation state. So what the British sought was the complete genocide of Hijras. So what that looked like is banning cross-dressing, making it a criminal act, kidnapping young people from Hijra colonies so that rituals couldn't be passed on, demonizing Hijras in the press and in the media, teaching Indian people to hate gender nonconforming people rather than hate the colonists, and then arresting and checking in on gender nonconforming and Hijra people to make sure that they weren't cross-dressing anymore. But despite that attempted genocide, people continue to persist. And that's what I find across colonial projects across the world, be that here and the violence and atrocities against First Nations and Indigenous peoples, Two-Spirit customs continue on. I mean, tomorrow night, I have the honor to be doing a show in Portland, Maine, and my friend Geo Neptune, who's an Indigenous Two-Spirit person, is going to be opening. And what Geo Neptune really speaks about all the time is our Two-Spirit ancestors passed on the sacred knowledge of existing outside the gender binary, and that persisted throughout colonization.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really important that people remember that when we say non-binary is new, that's participating in a kind of cultural imperialism and racism that disappears the long and vibrant legacy of Black, Brown, Indigenous people who have always existed outside of these gender categories.
Oh, I love it. And the history and the education that just seeps from you is amazing. You know, we've interviewed Vivek Shreya on this podcast, and she says one of the ways while growing up, being declared a boy, that she first got exposed to the idea of men with long hair and playing the flute was through Indian culture in Edmonton, Alberta.
Right.
You know, so a lot of I know the British is in the 1700s, but, you know, Ramayan is maybe a lot older than that.
Right.
Okay, so you live in New York. Gay New York was what we're talking about. You moved to New York, you're a freshman at Stanford, you come here, you're staying at your sister's apartment, you read the book, you say, I want to live here. How's New York doing? Give me the New York update, because I'm also hearing you say, I feel most comfortable in New York City on Halloween. I heard you say that, okay? I feel most comfortable in New York on Fashion Week. Every other time I'm violently, you know, castigated society. This is a pretty progressive city. I mean, if you're going to live somewhere dense and urban that accepts all comers, I'd pick New York too. Sounds like, how's the culture doing here? How's the community?
Yeah, I think what's important to understand about New York is that you're just constantly available to be looked at in public. When you live in other places, even like Texas, you at least have the boundary of a car. So here, you're on a train, and if you're with a transphobic person, you're locked in this steel thing together.
The subway.
So what's hard is that, yes, of course, New York is overwhelmingly progressive and accepting, but then there are a lot of people who aren't, and you're stuck with them, and you don't have a barrier between them. So the street harassment in New York is really intense, and I think that the city wants to perform itself as way more progressive than it actually is. Every single one of my gender nonconforming friends, especially those of us in color, experience brutal harassment here. It's really intense and omnipresent, having to text our friends whenever we're leaving somewhere at night to share a location, to make sure that we get home safe. It's just constant drone in our background of like comments on our body, this omnipresent sense of fear and violence. And it just irritates me because I feel like we should be getting compensated from the city of New York because we do so much PR. All the tourists coming here are like, wow, so many free, amazing, beautiful, fashionable people here, but the city doesn't protect us. So it feels hard where New York has this reputation, but then in reality, is that felt? Is that felt by the communities who've actually made it? No, because when we're talking about the history of queer New York, it's actually queer and trans people of color, specifically Black people, who created so many of the iconic queer staples who are now being policed out of those neighborhoods through gentrification and policing. It's the same police that arrested us for decades for cross-dressing that are now arresting and profiling so many trans people in the city as sex workers. So what I'm really trying to get people to understand about the world is in the same way that I'm trying to break out of these categories and absolutes and binaries. We can't say the North more progressive than the South.
Yes.
The city more progressive. It's all complex and multi-layered.
Yes. Yes, yes. You know, you said called it a drone in your background. I don't know if I could live with that fear in my life. You know, texting friends at night to say, here's where I am, you know, sharing a location so you know I get home safe.
Like, let me give an illustration of this. I think it's hard for people. I think what I struggle with is because it's become my reality, I don't think about it.
Well,
it's just my reality.
Yeah,
and then when I talk to other people about it, they're like, oh my God, you live like that? And I'm like, oh my God, I do. So like a couple of weeks ago, my friends and I went to go see a theater show in Boston of my friend, and we were coming back on the Amtrak. And I was so tired, and so I just left without saying bye to people. I was like, okay, I'm going home. I'm so tired. And so then I went home and I took a shower, and I woke up to 45 missed calls from all of my friends. They'd called my sister, called my roommate, called everyone, because they hadn't heard from me in 40 minutes. And I was like, what's up? And they're like, hello, we didn't hear from you in 40 minutes. It's 11 p.m. We thought that you had been attacked. And then I was like, oh, yeah, that's right. When my friends don't hear from me, that's immediately where their heads go, because that's the reality of my community, is that violence is not an exception, it's a norm. And it doesn't matter where we are or who we are, because gender non-conforming people are targeted and being hunted, and it's getting worse. And that's what I try to get people to realize about my career. Everyone's like, oh my gosh, you've had so many glow-ups, you're so successful, you have this many followers. And I'm like, until that materializes as physical safety for me, what? Like, what does that mean? Yes.
It's getting worse?
Yes, it's getting worse in the same way that Gay New York teaches us that actually we had this queer utopia in the 1890s until the 1930s, where visibly gender non-conforming people ran the city, and were visible, were public, we're not getting arrested, we're throwing huge parties, we're everywhere.
Yeah.
People knew of us.
Yeah.
Then they disappeared overnight. How did that disappearance happen? It looked like more implementation of the cross-dressing laws, throwing us in prison for violating their ideas of gender norms. It looked like more violence against us. It looked like more smearing us in the press as dangerous and creating more moral panics so that people got rid of us. It looked like policing people into the closet. That's what's happening in this very moment right now.
So when you say that the laws are coming and there's 280 pieces of legislation, you know, people take that as permission to act.
Listen, they're banning conversion therapy, but they're passing these laws as the new conversion therapy. What these laws are basically about is if you live an openly trans and gender nonconforming life, you will be punished. They're about making people comply with gender norms. Why is it that the majority of conservatives in this country are more upset about a, quote, men in a dress than about a global pandemic, about housing evictions, about poverty?
Extreme weapons.
We're being scapegoated. And so what happened, like to really locate how horrible this is right now, with this mass shooting in Texas just a few weeks ago, the conservatives are now saying this person was trans, and a 19-year-old trans girl in Texas was brutally attacked on the street as a group of men said, your people shot up that school. Right? So the very community that is being beaten is being seen as the danger and the threat, which means that we are seeing more reports. I get messages every day from people in the United States getting pulverized in the middle of the day and no one's doing anything. And it's specifically trans people. And that's what's also important about the history of Gay New York, taught here in this book, is that actually the term gay and the term queer were first used by middle-class gay men to distance themselves from people who we would call trans now, because they said, we're just like straight people. We're unlike those people. We're not rocking the boat. We're just normal men. We're not effeminate. And they would blame effeminacy for the reason there was homophobia, not homophobes. And we're seeing the exact same rhetoric here in 2022, where people say, look, tone it down. Okay, you don't want to experience violence? Stop looking like a clown. Why should it matter what I look like? I should be able to look like whatever the hell I want, and my safety should not be up to question. So it's easier, once again, to scapegoat us than it is to scapegoat a system that is policing all people into gender. In order for the gender binary to work, I can't exist. So it's the biggest publicist in the world that's going to tell you that I'm crazy, that I'm wrong, that I'm bad, that I'm dangerous. And it's ultimately not about me, it's about you. It's about making everyone think that the uniform is synonymous with their soul.
Somehow, I don't know why, when you say it's getting worse, that is surprising to me. I don't know why that is. I feel like I'm surprised. In this day and age, that would be getting worse.
That's where I think the Wheel of Time comes back. Or if we think about time as a wheel, it totally makes sense that it's getting worse. The only reason that we are shocked by that is because we have an idea of progress that is a fiction. Actually, what we have to understand is that oppression continually rematerializes itself and reforms. So what we have in the United States is a really awful prison system which takes the same logics and treatments of black people and institutionalizes it through the prison so that we can say there was an emancipation of slavery. But what does that mean when so many black and indigenous people are incarcerated in this country?
Highest rates of incarceration in the world.
Where they're being exploited for their labor in prisons right now, not compensated for actually doing the same kinds of economic labor that they did before. So actually what I want people to really understand is that this liberal fantasy that things magically get better without us doing anything, we have to puncture that. The only way that things change is if in our own lives we interrupt them. And what we need right now around trans people is don't wait until you're hearing a trans artist or listening to a trans podcast. In your own life, how are you interrupting the gender binary?
How can we interrupt the gender binary?
It looks like being able to see people as people and not as gender norms. It looks like creating space for men to be vulnerable, for women to lead. It looks like actually asking ourselves, why is it that the first thing we're clued into when we see someone is their gendered attributes? That's weird. Why do we assume people's genders?
Gender reveal parties.
Exactly.
And you know what's interesting on the gender reveal parties, because of course the progressive view is not to ask what gender. Are you going to find out the gender? Now you ask if you're going to find out the sex. And you have a great dismantling of that in your book. Then it's chromosomal. Then it's, sexual organs.
Right.
Right. As opposed to a quote that you said that I think is very inspiring. It's, I'm taking time to wrap my head around it, but my gender migrates through space and time.
I think all of our genders migrate through space and time because what I think a reoccurring theme in this conversation is that everything is in constant motion. Everything is in flux. Actually, change is the currency and the metronome of this world order. And all words do, all categories do, it's about as futile as taking your hand and trying to grab a fistful of water from a river. It's going to fall through. And I'm so irritated by how we keep on thinking that it's going to work this time. Putting our hand, it's going to work this time. Why do we need to know what the sex of the child is?
Yeah.
My sister just gave birth a few weeks ago, and so we've been talking about this a lot. And she's like, it's really hard finding baby clothes that are not extremely gendered. Really hard finding baby toys that are not extremely gendered.
Yeah.
The first questions people would ask, and she would just be like, I don't know. I don't care.
Yeah.
And people would look at her like so shocked.
Yeah.
And she would ask me, how do I create an environment for this child so that they know that they own their body and that they can communicate to me what they want to be called, what they want to be named. And it's a different model of parenting and it's a different model of love.
Yes.
And that's where I think it all really ends up. Category culture is anti-love because it prioritizes the narratives we have about other people over the narratives that they have about themselves.
Yes.
We're taught that love is coercion when actually love is consent. And what love has to actually be is creating space for people to self-author themselves.
Ooh. Category culture is anti-love. A nice little reverse lever into your third and final book, which is...
I'm giving you the banh mi's as well.
I know. You're amazing. You're directing the interview very well for me. Thank you, Alok. Which is All About Love by Bell Hooks. Previously picked on 3 books by Dr. Brené Brown in Chapter 75 and Dr. Kristen Neff in Chapter 80. It's number 793 on our countdown so far, and let's talk about it again. This book was published in 2000 by HarperCollins. The cover is bright red with the words All About Love, each written on 3 different lines in lower black, kind of a cursive font, separated by thin white lines. Bell Hooks, sadly, was... If you believe in life and death, an American author, professor, feminist, and social activist who just passed away, born in 1952 in Kentucky and died just recently. I know I saw Brené Brown talking about how she was just about to come on and talk to her and just before she passed away. All About Love offers radical new ways to think about love by showing its interconnectedness in our public and private lives. Hooks explains how our everyday notions of what it means to give and receive love often fail us, and how these ideals are established in early childhood. She offers a rethinking of self-love that will bring peace and compassion to our personal and professional lives, and asserts that the place of love to end struggles between individuals and communities and among societies. File this one to be decimal under 306.7 for social sciences / culture / relations between sexes, sexualities, and love. Alok, tell us about your relationship with All About Love by Bell hooks.
Yeah, I first read it as an undergrad. I don't remember which year.
You were
And
gender studies major?
Yeah, and I don't think I really got it at the time. And so I just reread it because I was invited to give the Bell Hooks lecture at the Bell Hooks Institute.
No way.
Right after she died.
Oh, I didn't know this.
And so they were
that's
asking me
amazing.
to create a speech inspired by Bell Hooks' work
Wow.
on the movement against the gender binary.
Wow, what an invite to get in your inbox.
I know, and I was like, how do I do this? Like, what? And so I reread All About Love just at the beginning of this year to prepare for the speech that I gave in February.
And this podcast.
And it hit totally different.
Oh, interesting.
Because I think when I first read it, I was
10 years
deeply,
ago, right? Yeah.
cynical about love.
Uh-huh.
I was like, ugh. Because the love that I had been shown as a young person and the love that we were fighting for at the time I was really involved in the marriage equality movement was a very singular definition of love that I didn't see myself in. And now I think I've gone through a huge paradigmatic shift in my life where it's not that I'm fighting against the gender binary, it's that I'm fighting for love. And because I'm fighting for love, the gender binary does not exist. Because I'm fighting for love,
It's just love.
it's just love. People are just people, and that's
Yeah.
okay. And so now I've actually have a different relationship with love in my life, and I think that has to do with a lot more self-acceptance and self-work. But what reading it actually allowed me to do and click was, the reason people are so vehement resisting this work that I'm doing, which I think is actually a form of medicine that could heal the world. The reason that people think that my medicine is poison is because it implicates the people who said that they love them. Because often the people who gender us first do it out of love. And it is easier to demonize me and ridicule me than it is to reckon with the fact that people had parents and families and religions and cultures and schools that told them to shut up and call that love.
Of course.
It is easier to demonize trans kids than it is to sit with your own pain of realizing that you were once a young person who was curious and wanted to own your body and someone said, shut up. It is easier to tell kids to shut up because that's what was done to you. It is easier to wear pain as a virtue. What Bell Hooks writes is that most people mistake anguish and torment as the only way to live. So when they're confronted with joy, then that's destabilizing to their world order. And that idea that people mistake misery as reality totally changed my political and compassion practice because I was like, they think that what is actually essential, self-expression, is a luxury. So they don't feel like they're worth it.
Say that again. They
think self-expression, which I actually believe is an essential need of all people,
be who you are,
is a luxury that is only obtainable by other people or only obtainable by privileged few.
Yeah, you can only get that if you're privileged.
That's why they call trans rights special rights.
You only have the freedom to think that you can be yourself because you aren't, saddled with the burden of work or with producing a livelihood or whatever.
But I think at an even deeper and more cellular level because our family units told us that if we were ourselves, we were betraying them, and that love was actually a muzzle that told people, shh, don't be yourself. Don't be the eccentric, curious, weird, introverted, neuroatypical, fat, hairy, dark-skinned, brown, different. Be the same. And what so much of parenting is I'm going to recreate myself in you. That's not love. It's actually about allowing your kid to be who they want to be on their own terms.
Yeah.
And I think I've been feeling this a lot recently with the death of my aunt because I, unlike a lot of queer kids, had a queer elder in my life who loved me as a queer person. And so from a young age, I had a protector who was modeling a form of love that basically gave me permission to express myself. Urvashi told my parents, you're not allowed to say anything when Alok wears what they want to wear. If you do anything, I'm going to come after you. She was defending me in my own family unit.
But her and your mom also had the same dad, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Right? The Allen Ginsberg progressive activist.
Totally.
So this is running in the family lineage.
Totally.
Although you're in College Station.
Yes. But what I'm trying to say here is Urvashi's love gave me permission to be as self-expressive as I am now. And so I actually...
It's inflaming.
Yes. I was exposed to a form of love as a young person that actually gave me permission for me to be myself. And that's so huge. And I see it showing up in my life so many times now. I feel so healed from it. And then I see so many of my peers who never had that, who were told to shut up and told that that was love. And now it just all clicks for me, where I'm like, oh, the reason people double down so hard on the gender binary and on gender norms is because they think it's a loving thing to do. It's because they think they're defending, Bell Hooks says, most people are defending the narrative that love can coexist with abuse, but it can't. And in order for us to receive love, we have to become fluent in our lovelessness. So what she's saying is that you have to, what I say in that speech, have the compassion to break your own heart. You have to break your own heart. That the people you thought loved you didn't. That what you thought was safety wasn't. Who you thought you were isn't. And that's scary work. No one wants to do that. And so instead of doing that, they demonize trans people. That's how it works. And so what I began to realize through reading Bell Hooks again was actually there is no such thing as transgender issues. There are issues that non-trans people have with themselves that they're taking out on us. This is not about loving trans people. This is about cis people's inability to love themselves. Because if they truly love themselves, if they truly believe that they are worthy of the Bell Hooksian kind of love, then they would realize that other people expressing themselves is the most beautiful and bountiful gift to them. So I'm not telling cis people, stop being cis, start being trans. What I'm saying is allow yourself to be expansive. Allow yourself to contradict who you thought you were. Allow yourself to grow. Allow yourself to transform. Allow yourself to be idiosyncratic, inconsistent, imprecise, and imperfect. Because that's what it means to be alive.
Listen to the inner voice, take off the muzzle, remove the strictures, and kind of live in a place that you feel most comfortable.
Yep.
Yeah. You talk about joy. You're on a 3-month tour, I think. I got 15 countries. I mean, you're in next couple of months, you're in Bucharest, you're in Lisbon, you're in Oslo, you're in Athens. You say, when you announce and talk about the tour, that the tour is centering trans joy. Mm-hmm. Because, and this is a quote from you, people just want to consume our pain and only associate us as trans femmes of color with tragedy. And you even write, I just want to chortle with you.
I love the word chortle. So great. Yeah, I just really have been going through this renaissance in my own life. Pandemic really got me together in a lot of ways. Where I was like, what is the reason why they're coming after us so hard in this moment? It's actually because we're pretty great. And we model a form of freedom that is tantalizing and wonderful and world-making and permission-granting. I've got to enjoy this life. I've got to love me and my community more than they're ever going to hate us. And so that's why comedy has been so much fun for me to write, is because I'm actually just really committed to creating space where trans people can laugh and relax and chill and feel leisure and levity.
Because you're right, because all the art typically, or at least the trans art that I've consumed, which is limited, I know, but it is centered around tragedy.
Yeah.
It's all about my dark story.
Yep.
You know,
and now I'm just telling really flippant jokes on stage.
Flippant jokes?
And it's really fun because people are literally coming up to me being like, I didn't know how bad I needed to laugh. And the truth is, that's the tradition of trans people as I study, is that alongside getting persecuted, we would always be cracking jokes. And jokes were how we got through it. And so what I'm really trying to do on this tour is to actually show people that, like, trans people are persecuted because of our joy making. That, in fact, shame is interrupted joy. And so when we're shamed about our body hair, shamed about our voice, shamed about our creativity, those were all earnest, intuitive expressions of joy that got stifled. And most people are walking around mistaking dissociation, calcified grief, and shame as an identity, a personality, a zip code, a geography, all of that. And trans people come in and we're actually like, no, you get to be you. And that's a joyous thing. It's a scary thing. It's a destabilizing thing. But how perverse is it that we live in a world that makes joy the threat and not the policing of it?
I heard a lot of laughs in the clip you just posted like a few days ago of your stand-up routine. Because I typed Alok stand-up into YouTube. Not much comes up. There's a lot of Alok interviews, not much stand-up. You haven't posted much of your stand-up.
No.
I guess he kind of...
I'm waiting for the big drop.
Well, I saw a drop, and it was a little clip, and everyone's laughing like crazy. You say, cisgender heterosexual influencers are my favorite. They teach me so much about love and life, right? Everyone's cracking up. Everyone's cracking up. Recently, I've been watching from afar, and I've learned that heterosexuality is an endurance performance art piece where you're running into a wall over and over again called marriage. What's your view on marriage? What's the wall of marriage you're talking about?
I mean, it's just really absurd that we have an entire campaign right now talking about how trans people are going to regret our decisions when the majority of marriages don't work. Like, hello? Like, there's this idea of the sanctity and sacredness of marriage, which does not manifest at all with the actual data that shows that the majority of marriages do not work. And yet we allow people to do it. If we're going to allow people to make those life contracts with people that have devastating economic consequences for the rest of their life without making them go through psychological screening, why can't we allow trans people to live our own truths in our lives?
Yeah.
So what I'm trying to poke
this is like
fun
a joke
at,
3 levels deep here.
this is my kind of humor, is I am first and foremost a nerd, right? So what I am doing is I'm taking complex academic critiques and I'm thinking, how do I translate them? It's very much like broccoli and cheese or like celery with peanut butter. You have to find a way to get people to imbibe the critique. And comedy becomes such a beautiful vehicle to do that. Because people might not agree with me, but they're finding themselves laughing.
Yeah.
And then in that laughter, they're kind of like, oops.
It's also freeing, by the way, to have conversations around trans and gender that aren't, you got to take a breath before you talk. Because everyone's nervous.
Right.
And I appreciate you creating space to allow us to do that today. All about love. All about love. You were extremely good at practicing love, the verb, right? You've thought about a lot. You just gave the speech at the Bell Hooks Center, whatever it's called. There's a quote in Bell Hooks' book. There was a time I felt lousy about my over 40 body, saw myself as too fat, too this or too that. Yet I fantasized about finding a lover who would give me the gift of being loved as I am. It is silly, isn't it, that I would dream of someone else offering to me the acceptance and affirmation I was withholding from myself. This was a moment when the maxim, you can never love anybody if you are unable to love yourself, made clear sense. And I will add, do not expect to receive the love from someone else you do not give yourself. How do we get better at self-love? You said at the beginning of this conversation, I'm practicing self-care, maybe you heard of it.
Yeah, I think it's extremely hard to do it. And it's a lifelong journey for me, but I'm doing it and I notice real results. The more that I accept myself as myself, the more that I feel rewarded by the universe for it. Because so much, and Brené Brown talks about this a lot, so much of connection is counterfeit connection that's based off of a lie. We're not being honest with each other, so we make dishonest connections that actually end up making us feel more lonely.
Common enemy intimacy,
yes.
She calls it.
Because loneliness is when we are in a room of people, but we don't feel seen. And now that I'm accepting myself, which means there are things about me that I'm going to bring into every interaction, and these rules about what you're supposed to say when you're becoming friends with someone or how you're supposed to express. I'm not allowing any of those rules to dictate how I relate to people. I'm just practicing my true, visceral, vulnerable self. I'm rewarded with connection, community, and intimacy.
And when you put yourself out there, other people, if they meet you there, you get a deep connection.
You
if
magnetize.
They don't, you move.
You magnetize the people you were meant to meet. I think I had been told, if you're yourself, you're going to lose, you're going to scare, you're going to isolate. And of course you are, to people who are not ready to heal. But then you're going to magnetize the people who are ready to heal. And you're going to create space for the people who needed to be there all along. And so actually, now that I'm seeing that the more that I love myself and show up as my full self, the more I get access to the kind of intimacy that I was seeking, I'm like, oh, okay, great.
I'll keep putting myself out there.
Yeah.
And that's why your interviews, and I want to just give a shout out to everyone listening to this who's enjoying this interview. Type Alok interview into any podcast app, because
and then you might get the Brazilian DJ Alok, and I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, with 25.2 million followers on Instagram.
I was like,
you're going viral. Oh, just a couple million. Aloks are going viral around the world. This is a books podcast. We're called 3 Books. We went into a million different directions here, but to close us off and try to kind of bring it back to books, do you mind if we have a few fast money round questions to get back into your inner geekdom on books? And by the way, I should mention to people that you're
I dressed for the occasion.
I was just about to say, and I was conscious, by the way, of not wanting to talk about your dress at the beginning, because I was like, I didn't want to, objectify you or anything. But can you describe the shirt?
I'm wearing like
an outfit, if you don't mind, because it is book related.
With like heart sleeves, and it says, "Book lovers never go to bed alone," and it's got a cute book with a heart.
Very much relates to one of our foundational quotes for the show, which is from George R.R. Martin, another fantasy author. A reader lives 1,000 lives before he dies, is what he says in the quote. The man who never reads lives only one. You know, the idea that you're always connected when you're in a book. Okay, first question, hardcover, paperback, audio, or e?
Paperback, because then I can carry it with me everywhere.
Nice. 2, how do you organize your books on your bookshelf?
I don't have a system. They're just all there together. So you'll find the most
Non-binary.
random. Yeah.
Non
Totally.
organized.
Non-categorization. Anti-category culture.
What if you want to find something?
I just have to go through every single one.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay, number 3. What is your favorite bookstore, living or dead?
Blue Stockings and the Lower East Side.
Is it living?
It's living.
Okay. Do you have a favorite library? You're a library person?
I love libraries.
Okay.
I actually spend a lot of time in the New York Public Library system. I just go and read, and I work there quite a bit.
Nice. Is there a book we did not discuss today that you give often as a gift?
Yes. It's a book called The Invention of Women by Dr. Oyewunke. It's a book about the British colonial project of imposing the gender system on indigenous Yoruba people in what is now Nigeria.
How do you make time for reading?
When I'm not able to make time for reading, I'm listening to audiobooks.
Specifically,
Wheel of
The
Time.
Wheel of Time. Do you have a white whale book or a book you've been chasing the longest in any sense?
What does that mean?
Like a book that you either have wanted to read forever and haven't, or a book that like has challenged you or you've gotten stuck in repeatedly. You know,
I'm really bad at the classics.
Uh-huh.
I'm always like, I should read the classics, and then I just don't.
Yeah. That's fair. You are uncategorizable, Alok. However, if you go online, you are called a writer, a poet, an academic, a comic, certainly an artist of many stripes. To close us off today, might you take a moment to share one final piece of hard-fought wisdom or advice to all the thousands of people listening out there? We've got book lovers, writers, makers, sellers, librarians, people who are certainly, like me, I think, leaning into this world that you're accurately, beautifully painting for us. Is there a piece of wisdom or advice you'd like to share with us to close us off for those seeking to kind of fall deeper into a state of pure, uncategorizable love?
Yeah, I think book lovers have a unique role in culture right now to teach people about the importance of editing. You know, Amanda Gorman, the poet, says, what if America's just a rough draft, right? And I just think that gives so much permission for us to be like, what if we just continue to edit and become better? And that's where I'm saying about becoming less bad through language. That process of editing is actually such a beautiful idea, which is that when I offer my work to my friends to give me feedback, it's such a generous and loving thing to be like, hey, you're not capturing what you meant to say here. What if we brought that ethos to everything? We're not capturing what we meant to do when we said love. We're not capturing what we meant to do when we said family. So we're going to refine it until we get it better and better and better.
Alok, thank you so much for giving us all permission to be magical, and thank you so much for hanging out with us here in Central Park and coming on 3 Books. It's been a real treat.
Thanks for having me.
Hey everybody, it's just me, just Neil again. No, I'm not hanging out in my basement with a backpack full of wires. I am hanging out in my hotel room in Chicago with a backpack full of wires. I interviewed Alok yesterday on a park bench in Central Park in New York City, and now I'm here today because I'm giving a speech to Pinterest. So I am in Chicago as I listen back to this conversation and record this for all of you. So, how's your brain? Is it stretched like taffy? Are you having to put the pieces back together? And do they kind of fit in a strange or unusual or different way? Remember when David Sedaris told us way back in chapter 18 that, it's always his goal with a short story that, you kind of come back now outsized, uneasy with the fit. Right? Was it chapter 18? Now I'm wondering. I'm just going to double check that. Was it chapter 18 that David... Yes, it was. I got it right. Perfect. Chapter 18. Outside. Do you feel outsized now? Uneasy with the fit? I mean, Alok is a stunning thinker. it's probably no surprise that they graduated summa cum laude, like top of their class at Stanford undergrad. And as you can tell from the quick pace, clarity, and lucidity of their thoughts, it's stunning. And the fact that they're so young, I mean, they're in their early 30s, means I think this is going to be a thinker that we are going to be watching and connecting with for years and decades over the long haul. How many quotes jumped out to you? I got over 25 quotes I pulled out. There's so many, but let's talk about 6 of them. Beauty is an instrument of social control. / beauty is about looking like yourself and not having to emulate other pre-existing standards. Well, what an interesting way to think about beauty as a social control mechanism or as something that we need to fit into. It's kind of related to our conversation on body hair, which leads into my next quote, which is being alive is inherently unruly. Because remember, as I sat down and spoke to Alok, as you may have seen in photos of them, they have a lot of untamed body hair. You know, it's like not manicured the way I and probably many others do, right? We think about body hair as something to tame, to control, to trim, to shave, to wax, to pull, whatever. And there's something so refreshing about the idea of being alive, being inherently unruly, and body hair being a metaphor for that. 3, the reality of my community is that violence is not an exception, it's the norm. And it doesn't matter where we are or who we are because gender nonconforming people are being targeted and being hunted, and it's getting worse. Okay, that was like a splash of cold water. Some of you may be familiar with the fact that gender nonconforming kids and trans kids of color have some of the highest suicide rates of all. They're staggering. Malcolm Gladwell recently wrote a piece in his wonderful weekly email dispatch called OMG. That's OH, MG exclamation mark. You can check it out. We'll put it in the show notes. OMG, where he talks about some of the rates for trans kids are like in the 30s, 40s%, like astonishing, horrible figures that we all need to do something about, and we need to amplify and sort of spread and share these messages as well as fight back against legislation that is dehumanizing and outlawing people to be people, which that doesn't make any sense. 4, so much of the work of healing is about being able to sit and situate oneself in what people see as chaos, incongruous, or dissonance, and be okay with that. Okay, so much of the work of healing is about being able to sit and situate oneself in what people see as chaos, incongruity, or dissonance. That makes so much sense. Very, very, very difficult to do. Just because Alok can sit in the ideas that they present so easily or naturally or maybe with some work doesn't mean we can all do that yet. But it gives us a North Star. It gives us a place to be. It gives us a way to start to see some of the binary kind of walls that we've built up around ourselves. 5, we're taught that love is coercion when actually love is consent. And what love... Wait. I said this wrong. We're taught that love is coercion and love is consent. And what love actually has to be is creating space for people to self-author themselves. Beautiful. And lastly, I thought this was a very liberating thought. I think all of our genders migrate through space and time. You know, I was talking to my therapist like 10 years ago after my divorce, and we were talking about attraction and attraction between people. And he said some comment like, everybody's attracted to everybody else. I was like, what? He's like, everybody's attracted to everybody else. Everybody has some level of attraction or unattraction or a revulsion or attraction to every single other person they ever encounter. And I thought that thought was so relieving. Similarly, I think all of our genders migrate through space and time. How relieving is that? Yes, if you identify as male or female, great. Wonderful. I do as well. At the same time, how uncomfortable is it when I went to a store and I see a shirt that I liked the other day, and then it's in the women's section. I'm like, oh, should I buy this? It's in the wrong set. Maybe does it fit differently? Like, what is the color sort of? I don't know. These are walls I need to break down inside myself. But when I think about gender migrating through space and time, together with Alok's degender fashion movement as one example, it's so relieving. Of course I should buy that sweater. If I like it, if it looks good on me and I think it's great, the end. That's where it should end. Genders migrate through space and time. And no matter how you identify today, make room and space for yourself to allow yourself to move and migrate through space and time with how your heart wants to be. Alok, you have dropped the bomb on us today. Thank you for adding 2 more books to our top 1,000, including number 686, Eye of the World by Robert Jordan, and number 685, Gay New York, Gender, Urban Culture, and the Making of the Gay Male World, 1860 to 1940 by George Chauncey. We'll just list that on the top 1,000 as Gay New York, wonderful social history book. And we are going to add an asterisk to number 793, All About Love, New Visions by Bell Hooks. That book now has 2 asterisks on it because it was chosen originally by Brené Brown, and then it was doubly chosen or next chosen by Kristen Neff, and now by Alok Vaid-Menon. So that's a lot of people who've chosen this book as their formative book, considering that for me, and I'm guessing for some of you, you hadn't even heard of it probably before. I certainly had not heard of this book before. I hadn't heard of Bell Hooks, hadn't heard about All About Love. I knew nothing about this stuff, and yet 3 people that we've picked who don't know each other, as far as I know, I mean, when I told Alok that Brené Brown picked it, they were like, wow, cool, like no idea, right? So this is a formative book to a lot of people. I think it's wonderful. I think it's beautiful. It's written in long academic kind of prose, not super academic, but just, it's like big chunky essays. So if you're up for big chunky essays about love and the philosophy of love, this is the book for you. It's a wonderful one. Okay, now, thank you so much to Alok Vaid-Menon. Thank you to Don Olson for suggesting Alok. And thank you to all of you for joining us on the park bench down in New York City. Are you still here? Did you make it past the 3-second pause? If so, I want to welcome you back to the end of the podcast club. This is one of 3 clubs that we have for 3 books listeners, including the Cover to Cover Club, which is everybody who listens to every single chapter of 3 books, and the Secret Club. I can't tell you more about the Secret Club, but you can listen or call our phone number for clues. Please call our phone number. I love hearing from you. Tell us a formative book. We love hearing your voice, your gravelly voice, your high voice, your deep voice, your you voice, however it sounds from wherever you are in the world. If you are uninclined, that's a sign. That's a sign that you care about the show, that you're listening to this, that you're here in the end of the podcast club. Please, I'd love to hear from you. Dial me up at 1-833-READ-A-LOT. That's 1-833-READALOT. And you can drop that last T if you need to. Run 833-READ-A-LOW. Or you can send me a voicemail over email if you prefer, in case you're calling from some country that somehow doesn't able to call this international accessible number. Okay, with that preamble, let's jump into the phone calls now.
Hey, Neil. This is Mary from Dallas, Texas. I am loving your podcast. Found you after a whole year of listening to the news about the pandemic, the politics in America, and how crazy it is, and needed something happy and fun. Slowly making my way through your catalog of chapters because I'm a completist and have to start at the beginning. So I'm pretty far behind. Just listens to James Fry, but I'm loving it. I have just passed the information about your podcast on to my dad, who's going to be retiring at the end of this month, and hoping that we can make this kind of a special thing that we can do and listen to people suggest some amazing books, and maybe he and I can read them together, and that's how we can travel during his retirement, being 300 miles apart. So, yes, loving this, loving everything about it. Thank you for what you do, for what you're putting out in the world. We're all enjoying it, and I can't wait to continue to listen to this for 20 more years. Thanks, Neil.
Thank you so much to Mary from Dallas, Texas for the wonderful voicemail. Oh, yeah, chapter 25 with James Fry, F-R-E-Y, Fry. Everyone says Frey, but it's actually Fry. I learned while I researched James Fry. That one came out on the full moon of March 20th, 2019. If you don't remember, James's 3 books were number 930, Tropic of Cancer by Henry Miller, number 929, The Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. That was the day, by the way, in the interview I learned that T-A-O is pronounced D-A-O, Tao Te Ching. Although James being so wonderful and kind and empathetic, it's like, you can say it any way you want. But I kind of looked it up after and I was like, wow, it's supposed to be Tao. Or, no shitting on yourselves, as Lisa Labute would say. Or number 928, Paris Spleen by Charles Baudelaire, which features a wonderful poem in there, Get Drunk, which I highly recommend. By the way, as a side note, James Fry is one of my favorite people to follow on Instagram. Yes, I do not like Instagram. Yes, I do not like social media. But James Fry, who's at JAMESFREY _ has 9,174 followers and only posts like their life. There's no posturing. There's no positioning. There's no trendy videos with captions like, this is the one thing you should say to your boss, or this is the one thing you need to do to get healthy, or this is the one. It's like James is just James. He's just like James. His bio is books, art, cars, tacos, sneakers, dogs. I just love that. And as I look at his Instagram profile now, it's just like, a picture of like crumpled Taco Bell. And it's like, when you meet up with an old close friend, #live mas at Taco Bell. Then the next thing's like a video of Top Gun. It's great, absurd and magnificent. #80s rule. #Tom Cruise forever. Then it's like, not a bad Monday night. It's just like him sitting in a hot tub or him on a golf course. It's just like James is just chilling and hanging out. How antithetical to the posture and kind of pedestal that we put him on. I always allow alliteration. Back in the A Million Little Pieces days. I am so glad that we got to kind of pull forward the conversation and connection with James. So shout out to James Fry from Mary and me today. And no, Mary's not 20 years. Thank goodness. It's only 10 more. 10 more to go, a decade. But I'm sure I'll have some wild and crazy project after that. All right. And now let's move on to the letter of the chapter. This letter comes on iTunes. It's an iTunes review. Love iTunes reviews. Try not to ask for them. We prefer letters, just not paper letters. I try not to get obsessed with the numerical and quantitative metrics that are so easy and seductive to fall into. Having said that, whenever you read a review, I always read them, and I often read them on the air. And when I read them on the air, you get a book. So, happier in Canada? You win a book. 5 stars. Thank you, Neil, for embarking on this phenomenal journey. Knowing the levels to which you prepare for these interviews allows for deep and formative conversation. As a teacher, I am inspired to use this format of literature review to have my students think of books in a more worldly way to potentially inspire lifelong book lovers. Oh, that's interesting. Okay, teachers out there, which specific chapter are you using in the classroom? I know a teacher that has used Angie Thomas before. That's chapter 26. I guess it's got to be the right length. Maybe it's got to touch on some social justice stuff, or maybe it's got to touch on some issues that you're talking about in the classroom. If you're a teacher, give me a call, 1-833-READ-A-LOT, or leave me a review. Let me know which things are resonating with your classes. It's always wonderful to learn. Okay. Now, let's move on to the word of the chapter. Are you bracing yourself? You know Alok is articulate. Okay? It's gonna be a word cloud, people. Buckle up. Let's go in now.
It would remind everyone that all binaries in the face of the primordial noise, dissociated valence. Beauty is kind of a bludgeon. Language is constantly shifting and changing and creating and combusting. Inherently unruly, encapsulate, incongruous. Beauty is about self-immolation. Lucid. Racist tropes. Meta. Destroying and pulverizing me. Undulates. Draconian laws. Anachronistic. There's actually a plethora, much more porous understanding. Epistemic authority. Demonizing Hydra's constant drone metronome. Imbibe the critique.
Holy cow, are you still here? Did you make it past one of the most epic word clouds we've had in 3 books history? I think that one ranks somewhere up there with the George Saunders word cloud of chapter 75. Remember we started word clouds back in chapter 18 with Rich Gibbons down in San Diego, right? That was our first one ever. And since then, if you go to 3books.co/FAQ, you find a list of every single chapter that has a word cloud on it. What's a word cloud? It's when the guest uses a bunch of words that I probably just don't understand. So what I do is I pick one out and I go deep a little bit on it. We find the etymology of it. We try our best to understand it. In this case, let's pick the word Hydra.
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 Hijra. Wikipedia says in the Indian subcontinent, Hijra are eunuchs, intersex people, or transgender people. Also known as Aruvani, Jagpapa. The Hijra community in India sometimes prefer to call themselves Kinnar or Kinner, referring to the mythological beings that excel in song and dance. Hijras are officially recognized as a third gender in the Indian subcontinent, being considered neither completely male nor female. Hijras have a recorded history in the Indian subcontinent since antiquity, as suggested by the Kama Sutra. Starting in the 19th century, Hijras were targeted by British colonial authorities who sought to eradicate them, criminalized under Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code from 1860, and they were labeled as a criminal tribe in 1871. This encouraged anti-Hijra sentiments through the Indian subcontinent, the legacies of which continue in the post-colonial era. There's a lot more on this Wikipedia entry. We're going to link to the whole thing rather than me kind of reading the whole thing. I will say that on the side, there's a population. It says India has 10 million plus Hijras. Pakistan has 250,000 plus as of 2017. Bangladesh has 120,000 plus. I will say that Bangladesh has officially recognized Hijras as third sex or third gender, and they've gained eligibility for priority in things like education and certain types of work. And in India in 2014, the Supreme Court recognized Hijras, transgender people, eunuchs, and intersex people as a third gender in law. So in some ways, it seems like they're a lot further ahead. Having said that, who knows the complexity that underpins that kind of labeling. New York Times also has an article that came out February 2018 called "The Peculiar Position of India's Third Gender." Hijras occupy a special place in Hinduism, but their relationship to modern Mumbai, where transgender people are legally recognized, still remains fraught. Okay, fraught itself could be a good word of the chapter. We'll link to both of those, the word of the chapter, Wikipedia, and New York Times article, so that anybody who wants to go deep in this area absolutely can. Okay. Wow. This has been a stunning kind of mental acrobatic feast. Does that make sense? Can you have an acrobatic feast? I don't think you can. Anyway, you know what I'm talking about. Stretch like taffy. Your brain, like my brain, probably feels like right now. And I'm a day out. Like I listened to this. I did this yesterday. I listened to it again. I'm still feeling the after effects of this wonderful conversation with Alok. I cannot encourage you enough to check out their book, Beyond the Gender Binary. That's the one I have read. I will look up their other two afterwards. And of course, you already know about All About Love with Bell Hooks, the Robert Jordan Wheel of Time series, and Gay New York by Chauncey, which we all discussed. Now, until next time, everybody, until next time on chapter 107, when we're going to go up from Central Park, we're going to jump in an Uber. Okay, and we're going to go up to the Bronx, and we're going to hang out with LaTanya and Jerry on the Bronx-bound bus. I bid you all fare thee well, and I want to remind you that you are what you eat, and you are what you read. Keep turning that page, and I'll talk to you soon. Take care, everybody.